there are two theories. One is Rubio has changed his politics to a degree and now embraces the Trump way of looking at things. The other is that Rubio is playing quite a smart game, winning Donald Trump's trust. And if he does that, then there might be in the future a few key foreign policy calls, for example, where he'll be able to influence the president, perhaps away from some of the more America first, isolationist thinking, because they'll have won the president's trust by that point. So I think the jury is out on which of those it is going to be.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Katy Balls, Washington editor for the Times and Sunday Times. Katy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
You've been writing in your Sunday Times column about Trump's inner circle in the White House. I mean, he's in a unique position, really, as a returning US president. How has his previous presidency influenced his team selection this time round?
So I think the truth is it's influenced it a lot. And when you speak to supporters of Donald Trump, they say this. When you speak to critics of Donald Trump, they say this. They all agree in the sense that Donald Trump has used that time out of government and the time in the wilderness to really work out what went wrong the first time around. And by that, I mean, I don't think it's a big secret that Donald Trump was quite frustrated with some of his team. You had a huge turnover of staff in the first term. I think it was, more than about the previous 5 presidents' turnover combined was how fast it came in, axing aides, bringing new ones in. And some of that came down to the fact that Donald Trump was fairly new to Washington for a president. He was used to having his family around him when he ran his businesses, a few very close, trusted allies. And all of a sudden he had this big team, and he was quite surprised to discover that lots of the people that who were meant to be answering to him and coming to him with solutions and didn't really support him, and also didn't really stand by lots of things he said. They questioned his decisions. They questioned his grasp of the truth. And that meant, I think, the second time around, so much thought went in before Donald Trump returned to the White House as to who the personnel were to try and avoid some of the mistakes as far as he would see it the first time around.
So I want to dig into who some of the key people are that you've written about in that Sunday Times piece. Susie Wilds, Chief of Staff. Who is she? What's her relationship with Trump? And what's her role in the current administration?
So Susie Wilds is Chief of Staff, and therefore, as advisors go, is the most important advisor. And structurally, that fits for her role. The chief of staff should be the most important. If they're not the most important, something has gone wrong. However, it's also the case that Susie Wilds, I think, is widely seen in Trump's inner circle as a really safe pair of hands. And lots of figures credit her with Donald Trump in part getting back to the White House. So when you look at that campaign, she is seen as one of those figures who really kept the show on the road and stopped some of the perhaps pantomime or squabbles that we saw in the past, and kept a real focus when there were issues distracting. She was good at spotting them, saying this is becoming a problem. Perhaps, for example, Project 2025, when that became a big distraction in the contest, and saying, we need to take the steps to press on. Now she is Chief of Staff in the White House. You see her give occasional press interviews, but she very much keeps to herself. She's not really going out there for the limelight. I think that's a wise move. It's her personal preference, but also a wise move, because one of the key things when it comes to staying key to Donald Trump and his inner circle is not trying to steal the limelight from the president. You are there to enable Donald Trump not to particularly question him or rival him. And so she, for example, has had an interview with Lara Trump where she talked about some of the work she did, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law. But when you speak to figures who are close to those in the administration or have written about Donald Trump for a long time, they will say one of the reasons that Susie Wilds is having a much better time of being Chief of Staff than some of the many who tried it the first time around is that she doesn't overstep. She is not a Chief of Staff who is trying to shape Donald Trump's thinking on what policy he should come up with, even what he should do that day. Howard Lutnick, who I think we'll come on to, and who is in Donald Trump's cabinet, he spoke about Susie Wilds on a podcast a while ago, and he said, one of the things is she doesn't try and change Donald Trump. Her job is to let Donald be Donald. And therefore, she's Michael Wolff, the Trump biographer, said to me, she is making the trains run on time. So it's quite a practical role. But certainly there is a feeling that if you want to get to Donald Trump, you have to get through Susie Wilds. And I think that does link a little bit to one of the figures who seems to be moving out of the inner circle at the moment, which is Elon Musk. Elon Musk returning to focus on business, less on government. And there have been reports for some time of a tension between Susie Wilds and Elon Musk. She has said she likes team players. She doesn't want people who make it about themselves. I think there was a feeling he was starting to do that.
So is that really what's behind the reason he's been distanced from Trump's inner circle, really? Is it just that clash with her? Or is it a wider issue that he may well be overshadowing Donald Trump?
I think it's wider than one person. And certainly, I think that when you think about Donald Trump and how he operates, one of the reasons this has been such a topic in Washington, D.C. over the past week when it comes to who's who in the inner circle, the kitchen cabinet, as you might call it, is because there have been all these stories about Joe Biden as a result of the original Sin book and this Politburo, so this group of advisors who had extreme power. And in those quotes and those sources, they almost describe it as Biden floating above, not having too much of a commanding presence. In Trump world, Donald Trump is king, and therefore an advisor can have more influence than another, but it's ultimately Donald Trump making the key decisions at the end of the day. And I think on Elon Musk, I mean, you will get furious denials on the record from the team Trump saying, oh no, he's not being pushed aside. It was always the case he would move to focus on his business interests more. But I think there had been a combination of factors. Initially, I think it was seen as quite positive, some of the headlines he was getting. But I think there's a question of how much further does Doge, which he was leading, have to go? Have they cut enough? Is there more that they can cut? Is Elon Musk support that helpful? We saw him pouring money, for example, behind a candidate recently, and they did not manage to win. And then I think there is the general sense of, is Donald Trump bothered by the fact that for a while at least people were saying, well, Elon Musk is actually really the one in charge. Now, there are lots of figures who know Donald Trump better, a lot better than I do, who will say that is the type of thing where, you don't want to have someone spoken of in that way in the camp.
So is that the end then, do you think, of Elon's time in the White House? And if it is, how do you think we could judge his impact on Trump's administration so far?
So I think we'll still see Elon Musk. I think there's clearly an effort to keep this on friendly terms, which you can see from the very fact that you have figures going out to say, no, 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 he's not being distanced. Yes, you might see him less. Yes, he's not really having this desk that was once spoken about. But for example, when Donald Trump met with the leader of South Africa recently in what was quite a fierce confrontation, Donald Trump plays those videos, he made sure that Elon Musk was there. Of course, Elon Musk comes from South Africa, has opinions on this issue. Now, he didn't speak, but I think the fact that Donald Trump is saying, Elon Musk is here, my friend, and talking about his friends, they want to keep it friendly. There's also the question of Elon Musk's wealth and how important that has been in the past to funding Trump's campaign efforts and the Republicans more generally. So I think that all sides want to keep this as a friendly exit, and you can expect Elon Musk to be popping up. The question is, how instrumental is he to the running of government? And these days, it does not feel like the answer to that is particularly high.
And inside the more traditional cabinet itself, we've got J.D. Vance, of course, the vice president. He's really become something of a darling of the MAGA movement, hasn't he?
He has. And I think what's interesting about JD Vance is if you look at the history of vice presidents, often it is a bit of a dead end job, which might sound bizarre to some UK viewers, at least, in the sense, obviously, it's a very senior job. But you tend sometimes to give it to the person you have to give it to because they, to broker that kind of deal. For example, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris didn't have a particularly close relationship. Yes, you have to make it work, but it often doesn't go to your closest ally. And the decision when Donald Trump chose JD Vance, lots of people thought Marco Rubio might get it, for example. There were other figures going around. But there was a push from figures in MAGA land, including sons of Donald Trump Jr., for example, to say, if you want Trumpism, if we call Trumpism that, to live on post Donald Trump, you need a successor or someone who's going to shape that. And JD Vance is better for keeping the MAGA flame alive in the future. And therefore, you suddenly have a vice president who I think is much more active in some of these political comments, whether it is Munich security speech. But also you think to the Oval Office, Zelensky, you had Donald Trump speaking, and then JD Vance joining in. And very much an active political player in the way that I think if we think to Mike Pence, who was obviously vice president in the first term, you don't see it as much. So I think he's far more important to the current political sphere we're in and to MAGA land and the future of the Republican Party than the past couple of vice presidents probably have been.
And there's also, of course, Rubio, who you've mentioned there, who's now Secretary of State. He seemed to be pushed a little bit to the fringes at the start of Trump's administration. Now he's coming back to the forefront, especially in the way that they're dealing with Ukraine, isn't he? I mean, what's his role like, and how's it changing, really?
So I think the Marco Rubio question is a fascinating one, and it certainly is a topic of different opinions and debate within Washington as to what is Marco Rubio really up to. As you say, Marco Rubio is definitely seen as one of the more, if you had to look at that cabinet, one of the more traditional Republicans when it comes to the politics of some of them around this table. And of course, some of those around the table, Tulsi Gabbard and others, they are not traditional Republicans. And therefore, you will sometimes hear the phrase neocon, and that Mike Waltz, who's already exited his role of national security advisor, he was seen as in that camp. Some thought, we'll look at Marco Rubio's previous views on foreign affairs. He is closer to that. And yet, you now do see a situation where when you talk to insiders about who is in the inner circle of Donald Trump's kitchen cabinet, his team, and by that, I think that is advisors he will listen to, sometimes at least, Marco Rubio's name keeps coming up. And it hasn't gone unnoticed, for example, that when Mike Waltz exited, you had a situation where, for the first time since Kissinger, you have Marco Rubio taking on the role of national security advisor as well as his role as Secretary of State. Rare thing to do. He has a lot on as it is, but and that might be temporary. I think the jury is out. Something Rubio might hold on to that role for some time. But that is a sense of Donald Trump trusting Marco Rubio. The other thing Rubio has been doing, which hasn't gone unnoticed, is making inroads into MAGA land. So we just talked about how JD Vance is, someone who, can speak to the base. Rubio has been making an effort, for example, to go to Butterworth's, which is seen as one of the MAGA hotspots. When it was the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you have all these after parties all across DC, and they had one there, which was Steve Bannon, often referred to as the godfather of MAGA. He was involved in the first term. He co-hosted this uninvited party at Butterworth's, and I attended, and Rubio attended, and he was this guest of honor at this event. And the next day was back there with his family. And I think there was an effort to say to this new coalition of voters, to the activists, he understands where they're coming from. But then you will hear from these old school Republicans, and they're slightly horrified because they thought Marco Rubio was going to be, in their phrase, the adult in the room, stopping Donald Trump from doing various things. Instead, Rubio seems to be embracing the Donald Trump agenda. I suppose just one further thing. There are two theories. One is Rubio has changed his politics to a degree and now embraces the Trump way of looking at things. The other is that Rubio is playing quite a smart game, winning Donald Trump's trust. And if he does that, then there might be in the future a few key foreign policy calls, for example, where he'll be able to influence the president, perhaps away from some of the more America first, isolationist thinking, because they've won the president's trust by that point. So I think the jury is out on which of those it is going to be.
And there is, in a sense, a bit of competition, isn't there, between Rubio and Vance? Even Trump has hinted at this himself. In a way, that could boil down to a pretty fundamental thing for the Trump administration as to which way the Republican Party goes. This more, new way of thinking, very MAGA-centric Vance, or very traditional and more neoconservative, as you say, Marco Rubio.
Well, it could do, but of course it depends what Marco Rubio really thinks. And right now, if we're being honest, no one in Washington is completely sure if there's, you will see these memes of blink twice, Rubio, if you need help, when he's at these cabinet meetings. And there's this joke going around online of he's being held hostage, but he also does seem to be embracing, for example, the free speech agenda very passionately. Let's see where he goes on some of these foreign affairs issues. But right now, he looks pretty full team Trump. So what is going on there. But I think Donald Trump himself is quite up for there to be a sense of rivalry between the two. The the moment when we all really started talking about a potential Rubio versus Vance for the Republican nomination for 2028 was when Donald Trump was asked in an interview about who his successor might be. And on this occasion, though it does change from day to day, he seemed to rule out the idea of breaking precedent going for a third term. And he said, there's lots of good people. Of course, there's Vance. There's also Marco Rubio. So he actively introduced into this conversation the idea that Rubio could be it. But there's also talk in Washington that you could have a joint ticket of Vance Rubio, by the time the next round. And people say that'd be a very strong offering.
And then there's also the people that sort of been come to be known as the real estate bros. Steve Witkoff and the man you mentioned before, Howard Lutnick. Witkoff, of course, has been at the centre of Trump's efforts on Ukraine as well as the Middle East. Has he really managed to secure any big victories, though? And where does that leave him in Trump's inner circle?
Off question is an interesting one, which is, as you say, you have seen unlike the first term, you have these new additions of, both Lutnick and Witkoff, who Donald Trump knows initially through business deals. And we know that Donald Trump sees politics like a business deal, the art of the deal. And they have found their way in with varying levels of influence, but certainly they have strong personal relationships with Donald Trump, which predate, lots of these some of the newer figures coming in. And that can mean other members of the circle, for example, Witkoff has been quite heavily criticized by some in the Republican Party, some in the State Department, saying, does a real estate developer have the skills to be going and having a negotiation with Vladimir Putin? When there was a story about using Russian translators, that's not something that someone who had been trained in intelligence would do. So I think both, and Howard Lutnick certainly on tariffs, some people questioned whether he is the right person to be, leading on tariff policy. Is he pushing Donald Trump to be gone home? Opinion varies, but there's a certain skepticism amongst some in Trump world between all these two because of the way they've come in. I think Witkoff, though, does enjoy a strong personal relationship with Donald Trump. And also, you look at the recent Wall Street Journal story reporting about Witkoff's son, crypto business, the relations between that business and members of the Trump family, and the bonds that do run pretty deep between the Witkoff family and the Trump family, which I don't think you can underestimate when it comes to how Donald Trump is going to see the issue on agreeing a foreign policy deal. And there is some frustration in the White House, of course, that Donald Trump said that he would fix some big conflicts very early on. And yet they're proving harder to do. But so far, I think that while the knives may be out for Witkoff and parts of the wider Trump atmosphere, there's not yet a sense that Donald Trump is feeling frustrated at Witkoff.
And what about Howard Lutnick? I mean, he's been pretty crucial for Trump's tariff regime, hasn't he?
He has, and then I think there's an interesting question here, which is Lutnick, and we get on to probably the golden boy of the cabinet at the moment, which is Scott Bessant. Now, both have been involved with tariffs. Lutnick, I think, had quite a bit of briefing against him early on tariffs, suggesting, this big bang effect. This idea of Liberation Day was coming from certain factions, including Lutnick, also Navarro, who I think we'll come on to. And he is at these press conferences. When you had the UK-US trade deal, he was there to talk about it. But I think while he has a friendly relationship with Donald Trump and links in, it's seen these days as though of the members of the cabinet who have an input on tariff policy and the economy, it is Scott Bessant who Donald Trump is looking to the most. And that is partly because after the markets reacted as they did to the initial Liberation Day, it was Bessant who played a leading role going out on the airways and calming the markets, and then actually suggesting what the plan is. So I think Lutnick and Bessant can get along very well, and there's not yet a sense that Lutnick is trying to undo that. But certainly when you speak to figures about, who they think the adult in the room, if we use that phrase, is in this cabinet, in terms of both what they're talking about and whether Donald Trump will listen to them, it's Scott Bessant's name that routinely comes up.
And how have the real estate bros, as they've come to be known, gained this position with Trump? Is it on any merit other than just having been close with him in his professional life?
So when I was speaking to people for the article I wrote, I spoke to a few biographers of Donald Trump, and one recalled, an interview that had of Donald Trump just under 10 years ago, where they said, who are your really close friends? Who, if you had a loved one in trouble, if you had something you're really worried about, who would you talk to? Which of your friends would you go to? And Donald Trump's reply was effectively, oh, well, I'm not sure I have ever really allowed myself to have friends like that because I would worry if I told them that they might come after my money. And I think that does give you an insight into even Donald Trump's close friends tend to be through, business acquaintances, through deals and so forth. And that is a way in which he, clearly knows these people for a long time, trusts them to a degree. Are they the closest friends? Well, the question is, does he have those?
Well, outside, a little wider reaching than the White House itself, you've also been speaking with one of the other architects on tariffs, Orin Cass, head of the American Compass think tank. He's not entirely behind the execution of Trump's economic policy, though, is he?
Yes, so Orin Cass, I think if you're thinking about who are the intellectuals or the thinkers of the current MAGA movement, what Trump's policy agenda looks like, he is a lead figure at American Compass, which is a think tank with close links to Marco Rubio, JD Vance. They have a new book, an anthology of their works coming out called The New Conservatives, and Rubio has a chapter in that. So there are ties in that sense, and they've been talking about tariffs for a long time. Now, I spoke to him just in the week just gone about how does it feel to see a policy you advocated for a really long time, come to life in some form, and then I think we can say come to life in a way which creates, to at least initially, quite chaotic scenes, warnings of problems on the economy, some serious turbulence. And he was saying that he didn't want to do one of the two approaches you often see think tanks do, which is either to disown the policy and just say, oh, they've done it wrong, so this isn't right, or to say, team sports style, this everything's amazing because it's my policy. So instead, the things he was talking about were the fact that, if it was the American Compass way of doing it, you would have less of a big bang when we had that Liberation Day announcement, more in terms of phase-ins, so people know where it's going, because if there is a chaotic feel of things, then that can ultimately lead to a loss of confidence, which is harmful. And then also was talking about how you do relay the policy. So I think we can all remember Donald Trump recently talking about, during peak tariff point, talking about dollars, saying, okay, well, yes, there might be some costs to these tariffs when it comes to consumer access and prices. You might have $2 instead of $30. He said, the economist in him, he said it drives me nuts when he hears that. It's more like $28 versus $30, or $30 from Vietnam instead of China, or perhaps you're getting stuffed cuddly toys instead. So it's an interesting discussion on, while they stand with the basics of the policy, what Donald Trump could be doing and the White House could be doing for a smoother rollout, but they're not abandoning the policy in whole, despite obviously, lots of people questioning it. And I think there's also a question as to, is Donald Trump himself going to keep sticking with this quite drastic policy on tariffs? Because often we do get these big announcements, and then there's a rollback when you see the response. So I think, as Orin Cass says in the interview, not even the architect of the tariff policy knows what is going to happen next.
And one of the core themes of your article here, Katy, is the importance that Trump places on loyalty. Who are some of these key loyalists that Trump has kept around in his camp, and how have they come to characterize his administration?
Yeah, so I think one thing to note, because we've already talked about the turnover in the first term, there are two figures who have managed to go all the way from the first term through to now, and that's Stephen Miller, who's the deputy chief of staff, and then Peter Navarro, who is one of the the people keeps pushing for the most drastic line really on tariffs when you think about the voices on tariffs in the room. Peter Navarro went to prison for Donald Trump when we think about January 5th and what happened there, and I think this group, they are a sign of how Donald Trump does reward loyalty. There's a question as to who is up and who's down at the moment, and you could argue figures like Bessant, who's a relative newcomer, have more influence. But certainly, I think there is a feeling amongst some in MAGA land that the lawyers just need to sit there. Some of these figures will come and go, and they will be left there, and Donald Trump will always listen to them in some form. And as others come in and out of fashion, they'll be there. And I think when you think of some of the loyalists, another one I mentioned is Richard Grenell, who served as German ambassador in the first term, now has a range of briefs, including the Kennedy Center chair. both Miller and Grinnell have been tipped as potential figures for that national security role, which I think gives you a hint of, who Donald Trump might look to, going back to loyalty if he does have to change things up. But all of this group, I think, are seen as pretty hard line and likely to be the voices, perhaps not pushing Donald Trump into the toughest line, but certainly not acting as a restraining force. And it will be interesting to see how some of the new figures in the court fare, to whether this group are the ones, they're standing there in a year or two's time.
Well, Katy Balls, Washington editor for the Times and Sunday Times, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.